Forgiveness is a very difficult process for me, especially as an Indigenous woman. As a Native woman who grew up in the 90s and the 2000s, I was bombarded with images of the Indian princess who embodies forgiveness, grace, and second chances for people who don't deserve any of it. So I gravitated towards the Native characters who were angry and fought back, the ones who got vengeance and demanded justice, because I saw how forgiveness was being manipulated. And even then, while these characters exist, mainstream media makes it clear what sort of Native characters they prefer. Their enemies can lie to her, beat her, kill her family, and cause irreparable damage, and she's expected to just let them go? Why? Forgiveness and abuse felt like two sides of the same coin. The bad guys were given a get-out-of-jail-free card at the Indians' expense. Being the bigger person meant letting the abuser off the hook. But why should I forgive someone who hurt me? Why should I forget that they hurt me and move on from that? But there's a maturity that comes with forgiveness. Forgiveness became less about absolving someone else and more about just taking care of myself. Sometimes it's as simple as just letting go of anger and hate because you're just sick of carrying it. Sometimes it's agreeing to disagree and just going your separate ways. Sometimes it's coming back together and mending fences. Every situation is different, but it can't be forced. It can only be felt on your terms, or not at all.
So I guess I gotta talk about Twilight.
The Twilight Saga is a film adaptation of the YA book series written by Stephenie Meyer. The first book was published in 2005, and the first film was released in 2008 to worldwide success. The saga concluded in 2012 with the film Breaking Dawn Part 2. For 7 years, the Twilight books and films dominated the box office and bestsellers lists alike. It was a terrible goddamn time to be alive because everything about this franchise is garbage. If one good thing came out of all of this nonsense, it was the conversations being had among so many young girls and women about sexism, domestic violence, and toxic relationships. For as many young women and girls who showed up to mindlessly consume this material, just as many spoke up about how Edward and Jacob are abusive, how Bella is absolutely being groomed and manipulated by the adults in her life, and how Stephenie Meyer's treatment of women in her work is overwhelmingly sexist. And then in 2018, Twilight came back into the public eye with the Twilight Renaissance, aka the most embarrassing hill for white feminists to die on. It's the time where every white woman on the internet suddenly had the woefully incorrect epiphany that Twilight was good, actually. Or at the very least, Twilight was harmless. And that the only reason why people hated it so much was because people hate teenage girls and anything that they like. The misogyny and the sexism that was once under discussion now centered the fans rather than the writing. Teenage girls enthusiastically loved a thing, so that thing becomes a point of ridicule and mockery from people outside of that target demographic. And then several Black, Indigenous, and other people of color who hated the series were like, no, actually, this franchise is racist as hell. In this new retrospective analysis of Twilight, the racism that is very prominent in both the books and the films is rarely given the same amount of consideration and attention as the misogyny and the sexism is. Which fascinates me, because for the native female characters in this franchise, the sexism and the racism intersect. And no character embodies that intersection quite like Emily Young. Emily Young is a macaw woman who was nearly murdered by her boyfriend Sam, a werewolf shapeshifter from the QUILUETE wolf pack. He fell in love with her as soon as he saw her, and she rejected him because he was dating her cousin at the time. When she turned him down, he phased into a wolf and mauled her face and arm. She survived the attack, but her face is permanently scarred. For all the conversations surrounding the abuse, misogyny, and racism in Twilight, Emily's story is completely forgotten, overlooked, and ignored. The Burke Museum dedicated an entire portion of their website to The Truth versus Twilight, where they directly call out this representation for what it is. Emily, as a subservient to Sam, exemplifies not a traditional role of women in the Native family, but rather a more sexist Western gender role. Native women, in contrast, are often leaders and decision makers in the household, rather than solely the cooks and caretakers of the men. Today, women are often prominent leaders on tribal councils, teachers, and activists in their communities. Women's roles have historically been equal to the roles of men, and this holds true today. A troubling message of the Twilight Saga is the disfiguring scar that covers the right side of Emily's face, a scar caused by Sam's violent and uncontrollable nature. Since none of the Cullens are scarred in this way, the image of domestic violence as an accepted part of Native relationships is a possible interpretation. The frightening reality is that contemporary Native American women represent the highest statistic of domestic violence victims and deaths. And yet, even though Emily has the evidence of her abuse literally on her face for all to see, this is rarely ever brought up, analyzed, or discussed in this Twilight Renaissance era of white feminist analysis. Perhaps the reason for this dismissal is because Emily appears to be in a loving relationship with the man who almost killed her. She became the object of his fixation, the author's words, not mine, when he imprinted on her. The term imprinting is used incorrectly in this series. Imprinting is when a baby animal forms an immediate attachment to its mother or other creatures who are constantly present in the early stages of its life. It has nothing to do with mating at all. The bond is between a parental figure and the baby is the one who imprints, not the parent. Imprinting in Twilight is this really weird way to explain what soulmates are between a male werewolf and a human woman. And it's terrible.
So Sam dumped Leah for Emily?
Sam hates himself for hurting Leah. But Emily was the one. Imprinting on someone is like when you see her. Everything changes. All of a sudden, it's not gravity holding you to the planet. It's her. Nothing else matters. You would do anything, be anything for her.
Imprinting is a bond that's formed between someone who's a werewolf and someone of the opposite sex. That bond is absolute, and the wolf in question cannot live if something happens to the other person. He's incapable of harming her, hurting her feelings. He can't be angry with her. His only purpose at that point then becomes to keep that person safe and happy by whatever means possible.
Only male werewolves can imprint because female werewolves are both extremely rare and they're infertile. Because, of course, Stephenie Meyer would use infertility to torture her native women in her story. We'll get to that later. Oh, and these men can literally imprint on, like, toddlers and infants and newborns. And they spend their entire lives like grooming them until they're old enough to have sex with, which is usually 17.
Sam originally was dating Emily's cousin and fan favorite, Leah Clearwater. When Emily came to visit her cousin, Sam imprinted on her as soon as he saw her. It is unclear exactly what she said that caused him to attack her. The book doesn't dive into detail, but the fanon explanation on the Twilight Wiki is that Emily rejected Sam and told him that he was acting just like his father, whom he hates. This was enough to make him lose control, shift into his wolf form, and nearly kill her, leaving her permanently scarred and disfigured.
Let me emphasize this. Sam wanted to be with Emily because she's his soulmate, and Emily told him no. And this rejection was enough to make Sam lose his shit, shift into a werewolf, and nearly kill her for saying no. He did this to his soulmate. As I watch these romantic scenes between them, I am recalling decades worth of rants upon rants upon rants from feminists back in the day on LiveJournal who had so much to say about how abusive Edward was to Bella and how Jacob is grooming Renesmee and how not one of y'all had anything to say about this. This relationship was not discussed with as much fervor and rage as the abusive relationships that targeted white girls in this book. Like how?
Emily and the tribe lie about her attack in order to protect the werewolves from the authorities. They tell the police and the hospital staff that she was mauled by a bear. She forgives him, and they fall in love, and all seems well and dandy afterwards.
To me, this implies that Emily is the one at fault for her situation, because if she had just let Sam love her from the very start, he wouldn't have attacked her, and I just... The book focuses less on Emily's situation and more on how guilty her boyfriend is, because every time he looks at her, he has to remember what he did, and I'm just...
You saw what happened to Emily. Sam got angry, lost it for a split second, and was standing too close. He'll never be able to take that back.
Oh, poor him. Please look up pictures of people who've survived being mauled by bears. And then you can come back here and tell me that this guy deserves a happy ending for doing that to his soulmate. No steps are taken to protect Emily from her violent boyfriend. Actually, considering how easy it is to set off a werewolf on a murderous rampage, none of the women on the reservation are protected or safe from these unstable, violent men.
Too late now.
Bella, get back. Oh, calm down now.
Sam is never held accountable for the damage he's done. He's not punished by anybody for almost killing her. Emily spends most of her time making muffins and doting on her abusive spouse and his friends, and that's about the extent of her importance. But it's okay, because imprinting. It doesn't matter that this whole relationship is giving battered woman staying for the sake of her family vibes.
Oh, and before you come in with, it was an accident, he didn't mean to hurt her. Know from the bottom of my heart that I don't care. Really think about this and just how normalized and accepted it is among all of these characters that this woman is in constant danger from her husband, accident or not. How all it would take for him to lose it all over again would be a verbal argument or a disagreement, and then she's back in the hospital or she's dead. And everyone is just okay with it. And I'm not even just referring to the characters in the book either. Did an editor not look at this and think, hey Stephenie, couldn't he have just saved her from an actual bear attack and then still love her despite how fucked up her face is?
because I don't know, that would have been romantic.
The fact of the matter is, Native women in abusive relationships sometimes do have to decide whether or not to do what Emily does, especially if their partner is Native. Do you protect yourself as a woman by seeking justice and reporting your partner for domestic violence? Or do you protect your Native spouse from white cops by staying silent about your abuse because speaking up can get him killed? And even if he faces justice, you may or may not have the best reaction from your own community depending on who he is. This is a very real circumstance that New Moon manipulates and romanticizes. And really, who romanticizes this sort of thing? How did this even get published? How the hell did you guys read all of these damn books and watch all of these damn movies and this just went right over all of your heads? And then I remember that if you're not Native, you probably don't even know who this character is. Or you just don't remember her at all. Because anytime abuse, misogyny, and racism in Twilight is under discussion, Emily is always forgotten. Her story isn't even worth remembering or mentioning, despite it being a central point of conflict for fan favorite Leah Clearwater. For all of the terrible things that people have criticized about Twilight, fans and critics alike both deeply sympathize for Leah's situation. In addition to the love triangle between herself, her boyfriend, and her cousin, Leah is the only female werewolf in the pack, and she is telepathically linked to all of them.
The book tries to paint Leah as this spiteful and miserable character who's just guilt-tripping Sam for the fun of it, and thankfully even the readers weren't having it. Even Bella's self-important ass is sympathetic to her, which actually blows my mind.
Wish it was Leah who'd stay home.
Come on, don't be such a guy.
No, it's not a chick thing. It's, a triangle thing. We all have to live the Leah, Sam, Emily pain fest.
How does the fandom sympathize with Leah while simultaneously forgetting that Leah's boyfriend was the one who left her for Emily and then nearly killed Emily before they got together? How come that specific detail isn't something that may or may not have contributed to Leah's negative traits and thoughts, which are often described as bitter and resentful?
I can only imagine being in Leah's situation when Emily was in the hospital, and later finding out that Sam is the one who did it to her. Did she go to his house and beat down his door? Did she scream in his face? Did the others have to separate them so Sam wouldn't do the same thing to her? Did she stay at Emily's bedside in the hospital while her face was being stitched up and bandaged back together? Did she know if Emily was even going to survive the night or not? And then after all of that, she falls in love with him right after she recovers? There are layers to this betrayal, and the book just treats it like she's a woman scorned. Because Emily doesn't have a lot of screen time and most of it is spent with Sam anyways, there isn't much of a one scene to really dive into and analyze. So I'm going to use this as a jumping off point because Emily's story is just a tiny, tiny drop in the vast shitstorm that is Twilight's racism, and it's about damn time we talked about it.
In the film adaptation of New Moon, Emily Young is played by Tinsel Corey. According to the sources that I trust, she is most likely not a Native American or First Nations actress. She is Indian, from India, and her legal name is Harsha Patel. Rumors have been circulating since 2005 that she's claimed to be Cherokee, and then Mohawk, and then Ojibwe. It's a mess. If you're not Native, do not engage in the Pretendian conversation because you are not equipped to talk about it at all. All you need to know is that a non-Native actress was playing a Native American character and that similar claims have been made about both Julia Jones and Taylor Lautner. There is even a rumor that Native actor Christopher Hyatt was originally cast as Jacob, but was recast and later fired because he refused to cut his hair for cultural purposes. As of this recording, I cannot get a statement from Hyatt, and I cannot confirm this as 100% true, but I definitely will not rule it out. If the rumor is true, this matters because forcing natives to cut their hair has historically been used as a punishment and as a form of cultural genocide. The native rep in Twilight is bad, but non-native actors playing native characters is never going to be okay. This is an ongoing problem and it will never be acceptable.
I thought Native North Americans could run all day.
Oh yeah, like we're really Indians.
As offensive and racist as these roles are, Native actors still had job opportunities taken away from them. This should surprise nobody, given how Stephenie Meyer shut down any attempt at diverse casting in this damn movie.
Stephenie Meyer is a Mormon. I'm not going to sit here and pretend to be an expert on Mormonism or their lifestyles or their beliefs. I'll save that for Matt Stone and Trey Parker.
And I believe that in 1978 God changed his mind about black people.
All you need to know is that Mormons and the Native communities that they've interacted with have a very long, bloody history. In his autobiography, Ojibwa Warrior, Dennis Banks says that relations between the Mormon church and his tribe alone were so bad that some tribes even referred to them as child stealers. If you don't know what residential schools or Indian boarding schools are, they were government and church-run institutions in the United States and Canada where Native children were stolen from their families and forced to assimilate into a white Christian society. They did this by cutting off their hair, punishing them with violence if they used their language or practiced their religion. They forced them to take Christian names and wear civilized clothing. Nuns, priests, and teachers in these schools inflicted abuse in every form on their victims. If a child was killed during their time there, their families often didn't know anything of it for months, sometimes years. Remains and unmarked graves are still being recovered from these sites to this day.
At Kamloops Residential School, the threat of death hung in the air.
You better behave. Don't get out of line because there's the graveyard. And there's also the river. Those were warnings that were given to us as little tiny children.
Suicide, I remember this young man or young boy hung himself in the bathroom. Still today they remember that. They still get nightmares about it. And about the runaways and people jumping trains, getting killed jumping a train, freezing outside, running away in the wintertime.
I could hear the steps coming towards the girls' infirmary, and I was the only one in there. And then I couldn't breathe.
According to the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, at least 408 Native American boarding schools operated with federal funds in the United States, and Catholic, Protestant, and Mormon missionaries ran 1/3 of these schools. Some of these schools closed in the early 1990s. But residential schools were not the only weapons that the church and the government had at their disposal. The Latter-day Saints Church was responsible for the Indian Student Placement Program from 1954 up until the year 2000, which was responsible for the trafficking and assimilation of 50,000 Native children. Between 2016 and 2018, there were 13 cases filed against the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints by those who participated in the Indian Placement Program, in which Native children were sexually abused by the Mormon foster families that they were forced to live with.
The last student to graduate from the Indian Student Placement Program graduated in the year 2000. This is not ancient history. Even if you were to ignore the Mormon Church's role in the abuse and forced assimilation of Native children, which you shouldn't, they were still an active part of colonial expansion in the United States. The Bear River Massacre of 1863 happened specifically because of Mormon settlers pushing Shoshone Indians off of their lands and into inhospitable territories.
And look, they hated each other.
However, while establishing Fort Douglas outside Salt Lake City, the soldiers and saints found a common cause:
to combat the Native American problem.
After the Mormon settlers burned down homes, raped women and children, and killed almost 400 natives altogether.
More than 450 Shoshones had lost their life. 2/3 of that number we believe being women and children. One group came up around this way, the other group went around the other way to get behind the village and flank them, and then they pushed the Shoshones to the river.
The Northwestern Band of Shoshone Indians had no choice but to ally with the Mormon Church while their land was stolen and settled. And this is just skimming the surface. So with all of this information fresh in your mind, think about how the entire plot of the Native characters in Twilight is written by a white, non-Native Mormon woman. How she took an existing tribe's culture and history, rewrote it, and depicted the characters as everything from racist stereotypes to abusive partners and pedophiles. Does she have the right to tackle this particular subject as a non-Native white woman who belongs to a faith that actively oppressed, dehumanized, and killed Indigenous people? Does she deserve to make money off of this racist story while the natives who inspired her didn't profit from it at all? Even when Mormons aren't actively colonizing and assimilating Indigenous communities, have they ever stopped though? Really? Apparently they still like to fantasize about it. And sometimes they turn those sick fantasies into multi-million-dollar book and film franchises so other racist white women can analyze it on YouTube. Is Stephenie Meyer alone in this bastardized racist fantasy of using Indigenous pain and suffering to push her romantic story about racist white people? Of course not! James Cameron and Taylor Sheridan are both right there churning out their own racist fantasies. Kevin Costner's been doing this white savior shit for decades. Johnny Depp's been pulling this shit even before The Lone Ranger and still gets away with it to this day. Greta Gerwig, a self-proclaimed feminist and ally, didn't have an Indigenous Barbie in her movie, but made absolutely sure she had a smallpox joke in it.
Oh my god, this is like in the 1500s with the Indigenous people and smallpox. They had no defenses against it.
Donald Trump uses Pocahontas as a slur against Elizabeth Warren for lying about her heritage. Native actors literally walked off of the set of The Ridiculous Six, the racist Adam Sandler film that both Taylor Lautner and Julia Jones both acted in. J.K. Rowling appropriated from more than one culture in her Magic in North America project and ignored the natives who addressed this. Taylor Swift is literally dating the star football player on The Chiefs and was present at the Super Bowl where his racist team went up against the 49ers while Native activists protested outside of the stadium. And last but not least, nobody does it quite like John Wayne. Am I right, Natalie? Originally, I was going to take this time to analyze how the conversation surrounding the Twilight Renaissance was dominated by white feminists with massive platforms and lots of unchecked anti-Native racism. But I'll save that for another time.
This is me being reasonable.
I will touch on this, though. One of the biggest excuses that people make for when these specific white feminists don't comment on the racism is that people didn't hate Twilight for the racism back then. Racism didn't even register on their radar when they were trashing the books and movies. It was about vampires sparkling and the love triangle and the bad acting, but mostly because young girls were losing their minds over this franchise. Maybe you're right. But then again, the fans didn't hate Twilight for the racism either.
But again, truth be told, if you're looking for the guilty, you need only look into a mirror.
You were the ones buying these books and filling the theaters. You bought the DVDs and the Blu-rays. You watched these films over and over again. The racism was not a deal breaker for you either. And no matter what a certain nostalgic woman tells you, Twilight was never harmless fun for teen girls. Because if something is racist, it is objectively harmful. Or did you forget that native teen girls exist, and this is how they saw themselves represented in your entertainment?
That's how they see me.
It was a cartoon. It was a stupid cartoon.
About a stupid Indian.
And so we come full circle. Even when well-meaning and more nuanced takes on Twilight's sexism and misogyny is under discussion, the racism is still predominantly ignored. Because even if the films were to cast native actors, and even if Stephenie Meyer suddenly left the Mormon faith, both the source material and the film is egregiously hateful. I will focus primarily on the anti-Indigenous racism in Twilight, but that's not to say that that was the only kind available.
For starters, can we talk about how Stephenie Meyer chose to make Jasper a Confederate soldier who was sired by a Mexican woman, and how she's the one who's depicted as this vicious, merciless monster?
I thought what Maria and I had was love, but I was her puppet.
Literally, that did not just happen. On God, I know you're not demonizing a Mexican woman during the Civil War and painting the white man who literally fought for slavery as a victim. And her seducing him is especially horrible, considering that white men who raped Black, Indigenous, and other women of color would often use seduction as an excuse, especially to explain to their white wives why there were suddenly a bunch of mixed-race children being born.
And then, of course, there's Laurent. He's characterized by allying himself with the strongest person and will definitely switch sides if it means his survival. This could have made for an interesting antagonist throughout the franchise. He could have easily been a Loki or a Littlefinger type of character, allying with different groups of people for his own benefit. Sometimes he's your accomplice, sometimes he's conspiring against you.
You suggest it's treason?
Only if we lose.
But instead, he just gets killed by a bunch of werewolves because he tries to eat a white girl. People of color just aren't allowed to have any room to develop as characters in this series, I guess.
This is obviously just my observation as someone who is not Mexican or Black, so take my analysis with a grain of salt. I'm sure people from within those communities would have way more insightful things to say on the matter than I could. So what happens when a white Mormon racist author turns a group of Indigenous people into werewolves? She has to find loopholes for her racism. After all, she can't use actual racial slurs for actual people, so she has to think of words that are derogatory for animals and fantastical creatures.
We see this in fantasy and science fiction a lot. Usually it's a white character who is the stand-in for an oppressed group of people, and they're being called half-breed or mudblood or something the white kids in the audience think that they can relate to. Harry Potter is an outsider despite being a straight white kid. Jake Sully is an alien despite being a white American Marine. You can see how this gets annoying and very disingenuous really quickly.
The whole clan hates me. Demon blood. Alien, that's all they see.
And sometimes they are known as half-bloods. You are a half-blood.
You're neither human nor Vulcan and therefore have no place in this universe.
Look, he has human eyes. They look sad.
But this time around, it's Stephenie Meyer writing pages upon pages, chapters upon chapters of her white supremacist brotherhood of sparkly Mormon vampires calling Native men dogs, mongrels, beasts, and giving them food in dog bowls, as if equating people of color to animals isn't literally utilized when you want to get people on board with a genocide.
I myself was put into a dog kennel when I was arrested.
Yeah, I was arrested for criminal trespass as I was, leaving a peaceful demonstration and getting into my car on a public road, and put in a dog kennel.
And what do you mean a dog kennel?
Yeah, it was a large chainmail dog kennel for, over 6 hours while they didn't even actually charge us with crimes. After that, I was strip searched and then thrown into jail, and finally, late that evening, was charged with the crime.
But funny story, actually, of being put into a dog kennel. The police officers are there and we're there, and we start howling like dogs. You're gonna treat us like dogs, we're gonna act like dogs.
And throughout the entire series, we watch as these Native characters are humiliated, insulted, attacked, and brutalized by white characters, usually for the sake of protecting a white woman.
Bella, what is that god-awful wet dog smell? I can't see past you and your pack of mutts.
Anyway, you're gonna come back, right?
As soon as you put the dog out.
Nothing's really racially charged about that, let me tell you.
Well, I can see what everyone's been talking about. Jake, you really do stink.
Americans tried to convince Europeans to start bathing, but failed. One of the natives tried to explain the importance of washing. His attempts were in vain.
Christopher Columbus was a low-down, murderous, greasy, ugly-ass bitch.
But there was one specific line from Breaking Dawn that literally made me want to throw hands with this fucking author. Stephenie, what the fuck was that? Medicine man smearing sloth spit across your face to drive out evil spirits? Babies not having caregivers with an idea of what the baby needs? It's giving white savior Christian missionary vibes. It's giving my church used to kidnap Native children from their primitive communities to give them a better life vibes. You can't even hide behind it's not racist because she's attacking them for being werewolves, not Indians. She's literally talking about a medicine man.
I mean, it's easy to understand the slip up because, of course, her opinions of Native Americans would leak into her writing. Throughout the film franchise, Native men are sexualized and objectified in ways that the white male characters are not. Another racist parallel between the vampires and werewolves is that the Cullens have their dangerous predatory instincts under control. The werewolves are a ticking time bomb, aggressive, more animal-like. Sexualizing men of color while simultaneously portraying them as violent and sexually aggressive is another racist trope that pushes racist ideas of men of color, especially when it's contrasted with the civilized white male heroes.
When imprinting factors into this, that sexual aggression becomes literal child grooming if the adult werewolf imprints on an infant or a toddler. Jacob literally goes to the park and looks at women and young girls in the hopes that he'll imprint on one of them. Quill is literally playing peekaboo and dress up with a 3-year-old, and Jacob jokes about how awful it is that he has to wait until she's 17 so he can fuck her. That's not subtext. That is in the text. Stephenie Meyer also made the decision to have her vampires lose all their pigmentation over time, which means that black and brown vampires will eventually have much lighter skin. This process is called the beautification process, which yikes.
This would also explain why the indigenous vampire hybrid, who is described as having rich, dark brown skin, looks like this. It isn't colorism, it's beautification. Also, what the hell are these costumes in Breaking Dawn Part 2? Costume designer Michael Wilkinson, who is Australian, says he was inspired by finding several different South Amazonian tribes and just throwing them all together for this Party City looking shit. These two characters, Zafrina and Senna, are supposed to be from the Pantanal wetlands in Brazil, which is home to several different indigenous cultures. Not one of them is wearing anything remotely close to what these two are wearing. They're also referred to as being feral vampires, and whoever edited their Twilight Wikia page sure used some interesting words to describe them. But the terrible costumes are the least of our concerns. The story behind the South American Tarzan-looking vampire with the really bad wig is shockingly bad. He, like Renesmee, is a vampire and human hybrid. His mother was an indigenous woman and his father was a Portuguese vampire who seduced her because he wanted to start a superior race of vampire-human hybrids. Which sounds awfully familiar for those of us who had to deal with the guys behind the Matuk Nation, which was a Mormon cult that wanted to breed with native women and steal their lands. I'd ask if this was just a wild coincidence, but given every other racist thing about this damn franchise, there are no coincidences anymore. When people show you who they are in great detail, just believe them. But perhaps the most egregious form of racism in Twilight is the treatment of their indigenous women. We've already talked about Emily, of course, so let's take another look at Leah Clearwater. Leah is treated with such contempt and spite from her own community, her own family, and even the damn author. Leah Clearwater is the only female werewolf in her community. The rest of the pack were all men and teenage boys, and she is an anomaly, a woman navigating life in a role that is typically only filled by men. To me, this sounds like two spirits, an umbrella term for indigiqueer, trans, or otherwise gender non-conforming native people. The role of two spirits varies from tribe to tribe, but they were revered for their wisdom and their spiritual insight. Sometimes they were healers, warriors, medicine people, and even chiefs. Leah, being a woman who fulfills a male role, should have been revered and respected among her community because she is an exception. She is someone who is special and unique and therefore has valuable insight. The elders could have taken her under their wing and given her special spiritual training. They could have prepared her to be a strong leader. This could have been empowering in its own way and perhaps even inspire Bella to consider a third path. Your destiny isn't limited to just finding your beloved, but becoming a leader and paving your own way. Maybe as a woman who saw firsthand how dangerous imprinting can be, she would encourage the tribe and the werewolves to take more precautions. Werewolves are not shunned from the community, but must live at a safe enough distance until their powers can be maintained and controlled. Women and girls who are imprinted upon are raised separately from their intended until they can consent. If they don't consent, they are protected, and the guys just have to cope. If a werewolf attacks them, like they did to Emily, they are punished for it or cast out. Leah, as a woman and a werewolf, could have been the bridge between both of her communities in the ways that the male werewolves couldn't. And because of her, maybe other female werewolves would follow. But instead, she is shunned. Her mere existence ruins the Wolfpack's little boys club. Her every thought and feeling is on display for the men who hate her. She hears their thoughts about everything. Her naked body, her failed relationship, her resentment towards her ex, and how much the rest of the pack just hate her.
Fun, isn't she? Wish it was Leah who'd stay home.
Shut up, Leah. What the hell are you doing here? Look, Seth doesn't want you here. Neither do I.
In chapters from Jacob's perspective, he talks about wanting to punch Leah in her stupid mouth. Hell, in the movie, Jacob straight up attacks her in order to defend the honor of some white girl he's in love with, and nobody even thinks twice.
Bella's human. Our protection applies to her.
She's dying anyway!
Even Edward judges her for being deliberately malicious to the rest of the pack. As if either of these pedophile douchebags have a leg to stand on when it comes to judging others for being stupid and malicious. But perhaps the most insidious thing Stephenie Meyer could have done for Leah was giving her infertility as a side effect of her shifter abilities. This is so cruel, given the Mormon Church's hand in operating residential schools where Indigenous girls were sterilized against their will. Preventing births among a targeted group of people is literally a form of genocide that continues to this day. Indigenous women in Canada have reports of being coerced by hospital staff to get their tubes tied right after birth.
Nicole Awashish was 18, in labor, and about to have a C-section when she signed a form she didn't know would prevent her from getting pregnant again.
Sometimes it was hidden during other procedure, getting an operation for her bladder, and 3 days later, her doctor says to her, "Oh, by the way, I performed a hysterectomy."
She's heard from more than 100 Indigenous women in Canada with a range of allegations around forced sterilization.
In addition to Leah's constant berating, her heartbreak, her rejection, the trauma of losing family and loved ones, she also has to deal with this very personal type of loss that is rooted so deeply in reality for so many Indigenous women. Tell me Twilight is harmless. Tell me Stephenie Meyer deserves an apology or forgiveness for making millions off of this racist fantasy. Tell me that the white feminists that I mentioned earlier deserve my respect when they defend this trash while speaking over and ignoring Indigenous women who bring this to their attention. Now that the bait and switch is finally ended, let's return to the scene in question that kicked this whole thing off. Emily and Sam's affectionate moment in New Moon is my one scene for forgiveness, because it so clearly demonstrates how white people want Native women to navigate in this world. Emily Young forgiving her abuser is so emblematic of how Natives are just expected to forgive our abusers and our oppressors and just remain silent about it. We are expected to give in to the biggest threat to our livelihood on the off chance that we'll be happier for it, that it'll be better for us, that it's for our own good. Because if we resist, we're divisive. We're causing trouble. We're malicious. We're acting in bad faith. They would rather we be Emily instead of Leah every single time. Dear Stephenie Meyer, I am not sorry. This is my one scene for forgiveness because unlike Emily Young, I will never forgive this. But I'll tell you who I can forgive. In doing research for this video, I posted excerpts of the most racist takes I've found in the Twilight books. I highlighted examples and commented on each one individually. While there were just as many bad takes and stupid comments deliberately missing the point, there were just as many, maybe even more, who were people who read the books as children or young teens and just now realized how racist the books were. That was enough to make me take a step back, because these readers weren't the white feminists with big platforms who deliberately ignore, omit, and downplay the racism. These aren't the same people like Stephenie Meyer, who poured years into creating this franchise and actively made racist decisions every step of the way. These were people who reminded me of my colleagues who watched Pocahontas with me for the first time since they were children. They remembered it fondly enough in their childhood because of how pretty she was and how nice the music is. But now they're horrified with what was allowed to be written and displayed for children. Anti-Native racism is so normalized, especially in entertainment, and especially in entertainment geared towards young audiences. If the adults around you aren't criticizing it and aren't calling it out,
Of course you're not going to think anything of it. And then when it's brought to your attention, especially by an Indigenous person, there's usually one of two reactions. One, you defend it, you make excuses for it, you argue, and you dig in your heels. Or two, you acknowledge it, even if it's just to say, oh my God, I can't believe she wrote that. Or, oh my God, that is offensive, that is messed up. And several of you did exactly that. You reread those words with adult eyes and adult understanding, and you empathized. You showed compassion, and I thank you for that. I respect you for that. I can forgive you. I want to close this with the wise words of Shuhada Sarakat, better known as the late great Sinead O'Connor. If there ever is going to be healing, there has got to be remembering and then grieving, so that there then can be forgiving. There has to be knowledge and understanding.
Emily tries, but misunderstands.